She had just stepped off the plane, the epitome of success, impeccably tailored suit, the confident bearing of a seasoned professional. She was jet-lagged, looking forward to getting home. But instead of an exit, what greeted her were the prejudiced eyes and condescending attitudes of two policemen. Without a reasonable explanation, they stopped her. The questions began, not about security, but about money, about the clothes she was wearing. What do you do to earn this money? A question like a knife to her self-esteem, a disguised insult based on her skin color and her success. She tried to stay calm, handing over her papers, speaking as professionally as possible. But her cooperation only seemed to anger them. They couldn't accept a young, successful black woman standing up to them, questioning their authority. And then, the unthinkable happened. In the crowded waiting room, under hundreds of curious eyes, vicious insults poured out. The culmination of abuse and discrimination, the cold sound of metal. Her arms were twisted behind her back. The handcuffs tightened around her wrists, leaving painful marks and utter humiliation. Why was she, a law-abiding citizen, treated like a criminal? Because of her skin color? Because of her fancy clothes? Or because she dared to hold her head high? What happens next? Will the truth come out? And what consequences will the two policemen face when they learn the true identity of the woman they just trampled on? Let's listen to this dramatic story. The weak, late afternoon sunlight filtered through the oval windows of the Boeing 777, casting a hazy glow on Dr. Amelia Holloway's delicate face. The nearly 6-hour flight from Los Angeles to New York finally touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport. A sigh of relief escaped her smiling lips. The business trip, despite the stress of endless meetings and an important hearing, had ended well. She had successfully defended her client in a complex intellectual property case, another victory that marked the beginning of her burgeoning legal career at the age of 30. Amelia stretched, feeling a pleasant fatigue spread through her body. She glanced at the Cartier tank on her wrist, a gift to herself after completing her JD at Harvard 3 years ago. It was almost 5 p.m. She was looking forward to getting home to her penthouse overlooking Central Park, soaking in the hot tub, and having a quiet evening. As the plane came to a stop at Gate C-26, Amelia calmly gathered her belongings, a lightweight laptop, a stack of documents, and a half-read novel. She stood up, adjusting her navy blue cashmere suit, perfectly tailored to flatter her shapely figure and healthy tan. Her Manolo Blahnik heels clicked on the floor as she stepped out of the business-class cabin, dragging her compact Toomey carry-on. Amelia's appearance exuded confidence, quiet power, and a refined aesthetic, unobtrusive, but enough to turn heads. She wasn't trying to impress. It was simply her style, the result of hard work and the success she deserved. The arrivals hall of Terminal 4 was noisy and bustling. People were streaming out of the gates, announcements were blaring from loudspeakers, suitcase wheels were clicking on polished marble floors. Amelia blended into the crowd, her eyes scanning for signs to the baggage claim area and the exits. She felt a few curious glances directed her way. That was not unusual. A young, well-dressed black woman traveling alone in a crowded airport sometimes attracted unwanted attention. She was used to it, learned to ignore the judgmental looks and the unspoken prejudice she sometimes sensed in the air. Usually, professionalism and composure were the best defenses. But today, something is different. As she rounded the corner into the main lobby, 2 police officers in the dark blue uniforms of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey stood against a large pillar, their eyes scanning the crowd. One was older, in his 50s, with a somewhat stern face and a name tag that read F. Miller. The other was much younger, in his late 20s or early 30s, with a somewhat childish but stern expression on his face and a name tag that read K. Baxter. Officer Miller's eyes fell on Amelia as she passed, a barely visible frown, a long, appraising glance from head to toe. Then he nudged his younger colleague. "Hey, Kevin," Miller said, just loud enough for Baxter to hear, a hint of mockery in his voice. "Look at that girl. She looks like she just stepped out of Vogue." Baxter followed Miller's gesture, his eyes also searching. "Some kind of show-off," he replied, trying to appear as worldly as his older brother. Amelia caught a glimpse of the conversation, or at least sensed the unfriendly tone and gaze directed at her. A vague sense of unease began to creep in. She tried to ignore it, continuing to walk, keeping her back straight, her eyes looking straight ahead. She had done nothing wrong. There was no reason to worry. But the two policemen did not think so. They separated from the pillar, walking quickly towards her with a purposeful manner, the somewhat arrogant manner of those exercising power. "Ma'am!" Miller's voice rang out, not too loud but enough to interrupt Amelia's thoughts and draw the attention of a few people around. "Please stop for a moment." Amelia stopped and turned to face them. She kept her expression calm and professional, though her discomfort was more evident. "What is it, officers?" Her voice was even, expressionless, but with a certain steadiness. Miller moved closer, close enough for Amelia to smell the faint scent of tobacco and catch his scrutinizing gaze. Baxter stood a little behind, his hands clasped behind his back, trying to look commanding. "We need to check your identification," Miller said, his voice commanding, lacking even the slightest bit of courtesy. Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Documents? For what reason?" She knew her rights. They couldn't just ask for papers without reasonable suspicion. Miller smirked, a smile that was not very friendly. "This is airport security, ma'am. We reserve the right to search anyone if we deem it necessary. It's just routine." Standard procedure. The phrase sounded hollow in this situation. Amelia looked around. Hundreds of other passengers were walking. None of them had been stopped like she had. Her eyes turned back to Miller, her suspicions starting to turn to certainty. This wasn't standard procedure. This was deliberate selection, and she knew why she had been picked. Still, she decided to cooperate, at least at first. Causing trouble at the airport was never a good idea. She opened her black Hermes Kelly bag, another symbol of success that now seemed to be betraying her, pulled out her wallet, pulled out her New York driver's license, and handed it to Miller. Miller took the license, glanced at the photo and information, then looked back up at Amelia, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Dr. Amelia Holloway," he read the name aloud, emphasizing the doctor. "You're a medical doctor?" His tone was slightly sarcastic, as if he didn't believe a young black woman could be a doctor. The feeling of outrage began to grow stronger inside Amelia. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I have a JD, she replied, her voice steady but a little colder. "I am a lawyer." Amelia's answer didn't seem to satisfy Miller. On the contrary, it made him even more annoyed. "A lawyer?" He flipped the license over and over as if it were a fake. "A young lawyer dressed like that must be making a lot of money?" His gaze swept over her expensive suit, handbag, and shoes. This time, Baxter, the young policeman, chimed in, as if to demonstrate his acumen. "What kind of job do you have that allows you to spend so lavishly? What company do you work for?" The question was not only curious, but also suspicious, as if the wealth of a young black man must have some shady origins. Amelia's patience was at its limit. This was no ordinary security check. This was scrutiny, judgment, and harassment based on racial and social stereotypes. Her tone became sharper, her professionalism tinged with suppressed anger. "My job is perfectly legal and allows me to live a comfortable life, officer," she said, emphasizing each word. "And I don't understand what this question has to do with you stopping me in the middle of a crowded airport. Do you have a valid reason, or do you simply not like the way I look?" The blunt statement, exposing their motives, was like a slap in the face to Miller and Baxter. Miller's face turned red with anger. He was a veteran cop, accustomed to being obeyed, not questioned by a black little girl. "Don't lecture us!" Miller snapped, his voice rising in volume, drawing more attention from the people around him. A few passengers stopped and watched curiously. "We're just doing our job to ensure safety. You're being uncooperative and defiant." "Uncooperative?" Amelia repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "I gave you my identification. I answered your questions, which were completely irrelevant. What is uncooperative? Or are you saying I have to be fearful and subservient to be cooperative?" She looked Miller straight in the eye, unflinching. She knew she was on solid legal ground, but she could sense the danger creeping up from the officer's demeanor. Power, when challenged, often turned ugly and cruel. Baxter, encouraged by Miller's anger, took a step forward, trying to appear intimidating. "We have the right to be suspicious of anyone who shows suspicious behavior, and your attitude is very suspicious." "Be bullied by you?" Amelia asked back, her voice now no longer hiding the anger. "Is that your definition of suspicious?" The verbal confrontation grew increasingly tense. Miller felt his authority being publicly mocked. Years of accumulated pride and prejudice erupted. He gestured to Amelia's carry-on bag. "We should probably check what's in that expensive bag of yours," he said, his voice menacing. "It could be something illegal. Drugs? Dirty money?" The baseless and malicious accusation left Amelia momentarily stunned. She felt her cheeks burning with anger and humiliation. In the middle of a crowded airport, under dozens of curious eyes, she was being treated like a potential criminal simply because of the color of her skin and the clothes she wore. "You have no right to search my luggage without a warrant or at least a good reason, a concrete evidence," she said, her voice shaking with anger but still trying to maintain the coherence of a lawyer. "Your actions are completely illegal. I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately." Asking to speak to a superior added fuel to the fire. For Miller, it was the final sign of intolerable defiance. He had lost all patience and control. "Oh, now you dare to demand?" Miller shouted, spit nearly flying. "Who do you think you are to order us around? Obstructing an officer of the law!" He turned to Baxter, his eyes beckoning. "Put her in handcuffs for disorderly conduct and disorderly conduct." Baxter, though initially hesitant at Amelia's insistence, at the stern command of his elder brother and perhaps carried away by his anger, acted. He stepped forward and roughly grabbed Amelia's arm. "Don't touch me!" Amelia screamed, instinctively jerking her hand away. She couldn't believe this was happening. Her act of self-defense was interpreted by Miller as fierce resistance. "See? It's resisting. Get it under control." In the chaos that followed, Baxter used his strength to twist Amelia's arms behind her back. She staggered, trying to keep her balance, but she was no match for the young officer's strength. The cold metal clanged as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. A sharp pain and numbness shot up her arm. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the utter humiliation that was engulfing her. Handcuffed like a real criminal in the middle of the international airport, with dozens of eyes focused on her, curious, pitiful, fearful, and perhaps even gloating. Tears welled up in her eyes, hot and streaming down her cheeks. She felt completely helpless, her dignity blatantly stripped away. As Baxter held her, Miller stood with his hands on his hips, panting with anger, looking at her with hatred and triumph in his eyes. He began to rain insults, his tone vitriolic and contemptuous. He didn't use the words directly, explicitly, as racist, but the implication couldn't have been clearer. "You insolent woman," he gritted his teeth. "You think you're a queen just because you wear nice clothes? You think you can do whatever you want with a little money? Let's see if you can still act so arrogant when you're in the police station." He sneered, a twisted smile. "I've met many people like you. You think you're better than everyone else, but in reality you're just—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his contemptuous look said it all. Amelia stood there, handcuffed, tears streaming down her face, her heart strangled by anger, shame, and a sense of utter injustice. She was a doctor of law, a law-abiding citizen, a contributor to society. And now, because of her skin color and appearance, she was being treated worse than a criminal. The world seemed upside down. Evil prejudice had triumphed over reason and justice. Amidst the turmoil of emotions, humiliation, pain, surging anger, a cold, rational part of Amelia's lawyerly mind began to rise. She couldn't let them destroy her like this. She took a deep breath, forcing back the tears, holding her head high despite her hands being cuffed behind her back. Her eyes, though still moist with tears, were cold and unwavering as she stared straight into the face of Officer Miller, who was still reveling in his petty victory. Her voice rang out, no longer trembling but clear, steely, loud enough for those around her to hear, drowning out the noise of the airport. "You," she began, her voice cold as ice, "have just made a very serious mistake." Miller sneered, still not noticing the change in her demeanor and tone. "Oh? Mistake? The only mistake here is that you chose to oppose the police." Amelia shook her head slightly, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "Your mistake was the assault and unlawful arrest of Dr. Amelia Holloway." She paused for a beat, letting her name sink into the tense air. Baxter, who was holding her arm, looked a little startled by the sudden change, but Miller remained unconcerned. "So what? What about Dr. Holloway? Who do you think that title scares?" This was it. The moment the truth would come out. Amelia looked Miller straight in the eye, her gaze piercing. "Because Dr. Amelia Holloway," she said slowly, each word distinct, the weight of each word like a weight, "is the only daughter of Chief Judge Benjamin Holloway, Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit." Second Circuit includes New York, one of the most powerful federal courts in the United States. Silence suddenly fell over the small space where they stood. The noise of the airport seemed to recede into the distance. There was only the deadly silence and the look of horror slowly forming on the faces of the two policemen. Miller's face, red with anger, suddenly paled. The smug smile froze and crumbled. His eyes widened, staring at Amelia in disbelief. Cold sweat began to break out on his forehead and temples. He stammered, his voice cracking. What? Chief Justice Holloway." The words came out incoherently, trembling. He took an involuntary step back as if he had touched something extremely hot. Baxter, the younger, reacted even worse. He stood stock still, his face drained of color. The hands holding Amelia began to shake violently. The metal handcuffs rattled, making a low, dry click in the tense silence. He looked from Amelia to Miller to Amelia again, his eyes bewildered, like a lost child realizing he had made an irreparable mistake. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The 180-degree change in the two policemen's attitude happened so quickly and clearly that even the people around them could feel it. Whispers started to arise. Some people took out their phones, probably filming earlier, and now they were filming even more. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they could clearly see that the arrogance from earlier had disappeared, replaced by undisguised fear on the faces of the two uniformed men. Miller was the first to make an effort to regain some of his composure, though his voice was still shaky and full of panic. He waved his hands hastily, forcing a crooked, apologetic smile. "Dr. Holloway, Miss, oh my, there's been a misunderstanding, a terrible misunderstanding." His voice was shaky and slurred, completely lacking the confidence he had had earlier. He turned to Baxter, who was still stunned, and shouted softly, "Baxter! What are you standing there for? Uncuff her! Uncuff her now!" Baxter jumped, fumbling to pull the key from his pocket. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with it until he got it into the lock. There was a dry click as the cuffs were released. Amelia slowly reached forward with both hands, gently rubbing her wrists, which were deeply scarred by the red metal. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, back straight, her cold eyes scanning the two faces that were pale with fear. Her silence, the terrifying calm after the storm, now carried more weight than 1,000 accusations. She didn't need to scream, didn't need to curse. Her contemptuous gaze and the truth she had just revealed were enough to crush them. Miller continued to stammer out incoherent, meaningless apologies. We're so sorry, Doctor. Holloway, we didn't know. It was just procedure. We may have been a little heavy-handed. Please forgive me. Baxter nodded vigorously, his lips moving in the same direction. Yes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Their cowardice and quick flip-flopping made Amelia sick. Just minutes ago, they had been the ones holding the power of life and death in their hands, ready to insult, humiliate, and use violence against her. Now, knowing the potential consequences, they were cowering, begging for forgiveness. What had changed? Not the nature of their actions, but only their status as victims. That harsh truth only deepened her pain and anger. Justice shouldn't depend on who your father was. She remained silent, letting their fear and belated regret consume them. She knew her battle had only just begun. Just as the atmosphere was thick with tension and fear between Miller and Baxter, a deep, authoritative voice rang out from behind the gathered crowd. "What the hell is going on here?" Everyone moved aside to make way for a tall man in a police uniform with the rank of lieutenant on his shoulders. He had a stern, experienced face, and his name tag read Sergeant Davis. He must have been the supervisor Amelia had asked to see earlier. Sergeant Davis's sharp gaze swept over the scene. Amelia Holloway stood upright, her clothes a little disheveled from the struggle, her wrists marked with handcuffs but her eyes strangely determined. Opposite were his two subordinates, Miller and Baxter, pale and sweating, looking as if they had just seen a ghost. He immediately realized that the situation was not simple. "Miller? Baxter? Report!" Sergeant Davis ordered, his voice unyielding. Miller and Baxter started, trying to stand up straight, but their postures were still shaking. Miller, being the older and more senior of Baxter, spoke first, trying to present the situation in his best light. But his tone was lacking in confidence, and his words were disjointed and contradictory. "Lieutenant, it was just a little misunderstanding," Miller stammered. We were doing a routine security check, and there was a little bit of a miscommunication with you here." He avoided looking directly at Amelia or Sergeant Davis. "She seemed a little agitated, so we had to restrain her." Baxter just nodded in agreement, not daring to say another word. Sergeant Davis frowned, clearly not buying the clumsy explanation. He looked at Amelia, his eyes questioning but still professional. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened from your perspective?" Amelia spoke now. Her voice was calm, clear, and coherent, like a lawyer presenting in court. She recounted the whole incident objectively, without adding too much personal emotion, but every detail was as sharp as a knife. "Lieutenant Davis," she began, "I am Dr. Amelia Holloway. I have just gotten off a flight from Los Angeles. As I was walking toward baggage claim, I was stopped by Officer Miller and Officer Baxter without any reason given. They asked for identification, which I cooperated with. However, they then began asking probing, insulting questions about my occupation, income, and dress. Questions that were clearly based on racial and physical stereotypes." She paused, looking directly at Sergeant Davis. "When I questioned the legal basis for my detention and the intrusive questions and requested to speak to my superiors, their attitude became hostile. Officer Miller accused me of resisting and ordered Officer Baxter to place me in handcuffs. During that process, I was physically restrained by Officer Baxter and verbally abused by Officer Miller. She held out her red-marked wrist. I was handcuffed and held without bond until I was forced to reveal my father's identity, Judge Benjamin Holloway. She presented the story clearly, without having to repeat her father's title again. The calmness and logic in her story, combined with the clear evidence on her wrist and the panicked attitudes of Miller and Baxter, were convincing enough. Sergeant Davis listened intently, his expression growing more serious. He was a seasoned cop, smart enough to know who was telling the truth and the seriousness of the situation. He looked at his two subordinates with disappointment and anger. "Miller, Baxter, you two stand back," he ordered, his voice losing patience. "Stand there and say nothing until given the order." The two policemen staggered back a few steps, heads bowed, not daring to look at anyone. Sergeant Davis turned back to Amelia. His demeanor changed. The sternness was still there, but directed toward his subordinate. To Amelia, he showed professional respect and apology. "Dr. Holloway," he said, his voice sincere, "on behalf of the Port Authority Police Department, I offer my deepest apologies for what you have been through. The behavior you describe is completely unacceptable and goes against every rule and ethic of our profession. We will be conducting a full and serious internal investigation into this incident immediately," he continued. "Do you need medical attention? The marks on your wrist look pretty bad." Amelia shook her head. "I don't need medical attention, but I want to make a formal statement now." "Of course," Sergeant Davis replied. "We will arrange it immediately. Do you have any other requests?" Amelia's eyes sharpened. "Yes. I request full, unedited copies of all body camera video and audio footage of both Officer Miller and Officer Baxter during the incident." Sergeant Davis nodded seriously. "Your request has been noted, Dr. Holloway. That tape will certainly be an important part of the investigation." He signaled to another officer who had just arrived to escort Amelia to a more private office so she could make her statement in comfort, away from prying eyes and the two people who had hurt her. Before leaving with the escort officer, Amelia took one last look at Miller and Baxter. They were still standing there, motionless, their faces ashen, their futures now as uncertain as the foolishness of their actions. The Port Authority Police Department's internal investigation proceeded quickly and without much hindrance. The detailed, coherent testimony of Dr. Amelia Holloway, a seasoned attorney, was a powerful piece of evidence, but the decisive factor was the body camera footage of Officer Miller and Officer Baxter. The tape does not lie. It captures the entire process: Miller's initial nudge and comment, both of their prying and prejudiced questions, Amelia's increasingly arrogant and hostile demeanor as she questions them, the unwarranted order to handcuff them, Baxter's use of force, and Miller's climactic, insulting tirade after Amelia is subdued. The tape also clearly captures Amelia's sudden change in demeanor, fear, and profuse apologies after she reveals that her father is Judge Holloway. It is irrefutable evidence of abuse of power, racial and physical discrimination, and gross unprofessionalism. The investigation was released a few weeks later. Both Officer Frank Miller and Officer Kevin Baxter were found to have violated a number of serious police department policies, including unreasonable stops, inappropriate questioning, excessive use of force, unlawful arrest, and discriminatory conduct. The consequences were swift and inevitable. Both were fired from the Port Authority police force. The career Miller had built over decades, and the fledgling career Baxter had been trying to build, were all destroyed by a single bad decision based on prejudice and a blind abuse of power. There were reports that they might also face a civil lawsuit filed by Amelia for emotional and reputational damage, but that was not made public. A few evenings after she received the official notice of the investigation and her dismissal, Amelia stood by the large window of her penthouse, looking down at the twinkling lights of New York City at night. Her glass of red wine was still in her hand. She did not feel as elated or happy as one might expect. Instead, a complex and somewhat heavy feeling filled her mind. She got justice. The two men who had insulted and attacked her paid the price, but she knew full well that this justice came not just because she was right, but because of who she was. If she had been just an ordinary black woman, without a JD, without an expensive suit, and most importantly, without being the daughter of a powerful federal judge, would the outcome have been the same? Would her words have been heard? Would the body cam tape have been scrutinized? Would Miller and Baxter have been fired? Or would they have been given a light reprimand and continued on their way, carrying on their toxic prejudices to hurt others? The answer she feared facing was no. The JFK incident was a painful reminder of a reality that, despite her efforts and success, she could not completely escape. Racism is not always overt acts of hostility or explicit slurs. Sometimes it is hidden in the judgmental looks, the implicit questions, the stereotypes, and the subtle but cruel abuses of power. It persists in the social fabric, in the minds of many, even in the most civilized and modern places. The suit she wore that day, a symbol of her professionalism and success, had become a pretext for suspicion and prejudice. It did not protect her, but instead made her a target. The irony made her feel bitter. But Amelia Holloway was not one to be easily defeated. The horrific experience, while scarring her soul, also ignited a stronger determination within her. She could not change the color of her skin, nor hide the achievements she had sweated and shed tears for. But she could use her knowledge, her status, and her voice to fight. She won't just be fighting for herself. She will be fighting for the countless other black people and people of color who face discrimination every day, who don't have the same privileges or protections she does, whose voices are often ignored or silenced. Looking at the city lights below, Amelia took a sip of wine. The slight astringency spread in her mouth. She knew the road ahead was long and thorny, but she would not back down. The incident at the gate was not the end, but a new beginning. A reminder of her responsibility in the relentless fight for a truly fair and equal society. She put down her glass, adjusting her clothes out of unconscious habit. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, steadfast and determined, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Her fight, and that of many others, was still going on. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.